Welcome back to the channel. I'm Stephen Heiner, and we're about a month into 2025, and I'd like to give you a list of my favorite reads from 2024. One of them, two of them, maybe more, will get onto your list for 2025 if you're searching for books to read. There'll be a link in the description below to all these books, as well as reviews that I did and ways that you can buy them, other books that I was thinking about. We'll start with a group of books which I didn't put in the original article because they were an entire different project of their own, and that's my Palestine bookshelf project. It started because I was reading so many books on what was going on in Palestine from all different perspectives, and it created its own project, its own website, its own YouTube channel. So I'm going to send you over that direction if you'd like to see more about the books and the documentaries that we're covering over there. So that's not included in the list of 45, but let's just say it's a general recommendation if you'd like to learn more about Palestine, what's really going on, as opposed to what you're being told in the mainstream media. We'll start with autobiography and biography. First one is 32 Yolks by Eric Ripert. This is very much a book in the chef memoir genre, books by David Chang, Marcus Samuelsson, Gordon Ramsay. You've read these books before, so it's not anything out of the ordinary there. But I do think it hammered home for me the point that great art does come from suffering, trauma, difficulty. There's almost an inevitable link between the two. And this book is just one more installment, I think, that solidifies that idea for me. Elon Musk, the biography by Walter Isaacson. It's the second Musk biography I've read. I first read the Ashley Vance one back, I think, in 2016, as well as this is my second Isaacson book. The previous one I read was the Steve Jobs biography. In both the Jobs biography and this one, people are going to argue we didn't get all of the story, but I think we got enough story to get a sense of who we're talking about. And Musk has only become more important since Isaacson's book came out, and I think it's very much worth reading if you want to get some insight into who this man is and why he acts in the ways that he does. The third book in the autobiography section is Kidnapped, about J. Paul Getty III. I have special interest in the Getty family due to going to high school in Southern California. We have two wonderful museums out there, the Getty Villa and the Getty Museum, and they were part of my high school journey, and I've gone to those museums since then. And I was interested in J. Paul Getty himself. I've read one of his books. Still have to read an autobiography. And I've also read Steve Cole's The Taking of Getty Oil. If you're interested in sort of corporate insider stories, something along the lines of The Smartest Guys in the Room by Bethany McLean, you'll really like Steve Cole's The Taking of Getty Oil. Sidebars to this book, which is, I think, a reminder to me, it doesn't matter how much money you have, if you don't have proper formation and you don't have a sense of the direction of your life, things can end very, very poorly. And this book, I think, captures that very, very well. The next category we're going to talk about is fiction in general. The first one is a book I think that was very, very popular some years ago, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, set in World War II historical fiction. Very beautifully written, very detailed. We have two children coming of age during World War II, one on the French side, one on the German side. Really enjoyed it. Basic Training by Kurt Vonnegut. This is a novella that was previously unpublished, but I think is a really helpful, important story about things that Vonnegut would write about more in later novels. But this general, he's called the General, is the not quite an antagonist, but the person who the protagonist is coming up under, who is trying to get him to come of age in an unusual environment on a farm. All I have to say is I think it's very much worth reading. It's not the best short story you're ever going to read, but if you like Vonnegut, it's worth reading. Next would be Burmese Days by George Orwell. If you're interested in the Raj, as I have been for some years now studying it, reading through literature, art, music is another way for you to understand a particular historic period or a particular form of government. Burmese Days by Orwell, as well as A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, are two different lenses by which you can better understand the Raj, the characters involved, and at least the British side of things. Neither of these books really gives us a sense of what the native population thought. We do get some of this in Forster's A Passage to India, but I would say in a more limited way. It's still, I think, primarily the British view that we get in both of those books. Switching away from the British to the French, we have The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barbary. This is, I would say, even less of a study of France or even Paris, but of a Paris apartment. And the story almost takes place entirely within this apartment building. And if you're unfamiliar with Paris apartments, often many of the older buildings will have a concierge, someone who lives on the ground floor who takes care of mail, maintenance, security in a way. And this is a beautiful story about appearances and reality, and also about books. It's a sort of meta commentary about the sorts of books that people can read to think about their lives. And lovely, and I think the translation into English is well done. Finally, we have another short story, The Sunset Limited by Cormac McCarthy. Really a meditation on death, and it's written very much like a play. So as you're reading it, you almost feel the characters sitting in the room talking to each other. It feels like David Mamet in some ways, but very, very difficult conversations that I think are executed well by McCarthy and well worth reading. So next category would be foreign affairs. The first book here is The Burden of Memory, The Muse of Forgiveness by Wole Soyinka. These are lectures that Soyinka gave, which have been put into book form. And he's talking about all sorts of things here: African politics, race, reparations, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The idea of them, obviously, that's coming out of South Africa's particular institution, but reflecting on them in general. Are they useful? Are they helpful? And I think he does a great job of thinking about that. Next, we have Covering Ukraine, the Scott Ritter interviews, a war that was only supposed to last weeks. Here we are at the beginning of 2025. It is still happening, and we don't know how much longer it will continue. But this book, which captures interviews done over a period, I want to say about 12 to 18 months, I think will give people who are only hearing the mainstream media narrative a corrective, a view on the other side. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything that Ritter says or even accept what he has to say as gospel, but I think it will give you some other perspectives which are worth considering. The same could be said for the next book, which would be the Putin interviews. These interviews were done by Oliver Stone between, I think, 2015 and 2017, and will give you, I think, some deeper background on not only on the troubles in Ukraine, but on the troubles with U.S. foreign policy and the attempt at global hegemony. The U.S. is continuing to try to put forth this, we are in charge, and everyone else has to accept it, and if you don't like it, too bad, and we're going to try to sanction you to death. And we're starting to see, Putin was objecting at that time, has been objecting for many years, but we're finally starting to see that questioned in actions in 2025 with the formation of BRICS and other institutions and other blocs that are now moving to counteract this unipolar narrative. So you don't have to read the book, but the book, I think, gives more documents and more transcripts that were not given in the original interviews. If you want to watch the interviews, I think they'd be helpful as well. So they're available for purchase online. Next category is just fun. These are books that I'm just reading for my own off time when I'm not looking at a particular subject or I'm not researching something. It's just something I've been generally interested in. And the first book there is Astroball, which is a book about how the Astros went from a very bad baseball team to winning the World Series. Unfortunately, the book concludes before the cheating scandal is uncovered, and that's a book on my to read list for 2025. So you might see this video this time next year where I talk about how that looked, the cheating scandal of the Astros right after their revolution and the way that they built a team to win. But if you're interested in watching a team get resurrected, I think this book gives you a play-by-play of that. Next is Blue Highways and Blue Highways Revisited. This really beautiful travelogue from the 1980s, and then a picture companion to that, which came many years later. The Blue Highways are the not the big interstates that cross America, but they're the sort of back roads. And there's so many great stories and so many things I think that we've lost in America. And it's a way for you to go back in time a bit, as well as just enjoy some beautiful, reflective, thoughtful travel writing. I think that William Least Heat Moon, who is the author of Blue Highways, has really set a standard for American travel writing. Another sport book is The Dynasty by Jeff Benedict. This is one of the few times where I have watched a television series and immediately bought a book to dive into it. And I did so with this one. If you're interested in how a sports dynasty came to be, this was 6 Super Bowls over 20 years. Tom Brady and the Patriots. This book does a really good job of looking at the 3 big players in this situation: the owner, the coach, and the quarterback. And there's a lot to like about the book. And it was built in a really interesting way. You want to keep going with the story, even though you may know the events of what happened. You don't know all of the back end stuff, and that's what this book provides. Another fun book for me was Hamburger America by George Motz. I actually first met George in Paris when he came to do a pop-up for a restaurant that I was writing for. And I wasn't aware of this sort of love of the craft of the American burger, and George has been a chronicler of that. He has his own restaurant called Hamburger America, but this book is somewhat of a bible of family-owned traditional hamburger restaurants all around. And I've used it as I've road tripped around America to stop in and have some delicious burgers. And I can't say enough about it. It's something fun, and I'm going to continue to enjoy using the book through the years as I continue to do road trips in America. If you want to think about what it's like to be on the road for living in America, there's The Long Haul by Finn Murphy. This is a book of someone who was a trucker for many, many years. Specifically, he was a mover, so he would help people move their belongings. So obviously there's different type of truckers, people who drive animals or who drive different types of equipment or maybe materials, but he moved people's houses. And when you help people move house over and over and over, you learn a lot of things about the human condition. And he shares that in this book, as well as just, I think, how difficult life is on the road. This, I thought, was a great corollary book to Nomadland by Jessica Bruder and The Secret Life of Groceries by Benjamin Lohr. If you want to understand how the supply chain works in America and how it's built off of the backs of many people who are underappreciated and underpaid, I think those are books that will help complement The Long Haul. History. I have a friend, a couple that I know in Paris very well, and she sort of teased me. We were at dinner, and I said, "Oh, I recently read about the Battle of Midway, a book on the battle." And she said, "Of course you did." This is sort of joke that, of course I'm going to read about the Battle of Midway, but it was unexpected to me in the sense of I'd known about the Battle of Midway. It's an important battle in the Pacific in World War II, but I didn't really appreciate how important the Battle of Midway was until I read this book, and understanding what led up to it, why was it decisive, why did it change the course of the war, and what it revealed about Japanese and American culture and engineering, what led to that battle, and how the planes and carriers were built that got to that battle. There's a lot of insight which I think is still relevant to Japanese and American culture today. So a classic example of read a book about one thing, gain insights into something else. As I alluded to earlier, I've been studying the British Raj in India. I talked about Burmese Days and A Passage to India. This one, a social history, the British in India, A Social History of the Raj, by David Gilmour, beautifully written, and it does exactly what it says on the book title. It is a social history of the Raj. So we're getting a sense of who was it that would go to India from England? What did they do when they were there? What did they do when they came back to England? Did they come back to England? How were these different parts of India administered, and by whom? So if you're not interested in the Raj, you're probably not going to pick it up. But I think it's helpful, as I say, if you don't just want to read a history book that might feel like a textbook. You might read a novel, you might watch a film, you might listen to music, you might look at some art, or you might read Gilmour's book, A Social History of the Raj. Another Wonderful historical book that perhaps I should have read sooner is the Journals of Lewis and Clark. This is an abridged version. Obviously, you can always go find the originals, but you're going to see it articulated in different ways. Stephen Ambrose has another articulation of the Lewis and Clark journals. But you really get an appreciation for the type of men that we have. And I'm sure we still have men like Lewis and Clark, but I think thinking about what they did in that era, we tend to think we have the internet, we have GPS, we have all of these things at our fingertips. And these men went out into the wilderness. They were gone for so long, people thought they were dead. When they finally returned, everyone was surprised. But they managed to map out the Louisiana Purchase and really get a sense of who was out there, what kind of animals were there, what kind of rivers were there, and just a great sense of exploration. Also, studying diplomacy. How do you deal with peoples who you haven't met before and you're representing a government to them? How do you interact with them? How do you deal with unexpected winter storms or dealing with the territory that's not mapped? I found it to be really, really fascinating. And for those of you who've ever driven in the territories of the Louisiana Purchase, I think it's going to give you a greater appreciation and insight into these very beautiful lands, thinking about what it was to be out there, some of the first people to step foot in any of these areas and map them. Along these same lines, if you'd like to see portraits of the people who inhabited some of these lands, you would do well to pick up portraits, The Many Faces of the Native Americans by Edward S. Curtis. This is mostly a photo book. There is background behind a lot of the photos as to who these people were and how Curtis arranged the shot, but it's an anthropological study which has its flaws, but is still a way for us to get a sense of the people that used to live in the American West. Speaking of people who used to live, period, we have the Waco Siege, an American tragedy. If you'd like a general overview of the Waco tragedy, I find Waco in general to be very instructive about the United States in the present tense. There are many, many storylines that come together in Waco. And I'm less recommending this book specifically and saying, oh, this is a wonderful book, as more of this was another book that I've read about Waco. I've read probably 3 or 4 books about Waco up till now. And it was just the one that I read last year. So it's just a chance for me to recommend a book, any book about Waco, so that you can better understand America. I think understanding what happened at Waco is to understand the problems and the tensions that we have in America about religion, about guns, about government, about personal personal relationships, family dynamics. There's a lot about Waco that I think is instructive. So if you're not from the United States, or even if you are from the United States, check out Waco. If you don't check out this book, check out something. You could watch the miniseries, which I also recommended in the article, which came out on Paramount. It's just called Waco. Next category is personal development. At the top of the list in alphabetical order is Chop Wood, Carry Water. This was I think very much written for younger people, and it's a book that I would give to younger people in my life to help them understand the importance of building up love in your craft. Probably a companion book for this would be So Good They Can't Ignore You, by the same person who did Deep Work. I'm forgetting his name at the moment. But these are people. This concept of chop wood, carry water is the idea of working through the difficulties instead of accepting the instant gratification which our culture has given us, and saying, as I do that, as I become so good that I can't be ignored, I'm going to build a more meaningful life as far as work goes. And that satisfaction in work will necessarily build out to other areas of your life. So I think it's a lesson any of us can benefit from, but I think it's something that particularly young people who are at the beginning of their professional and personal journeys would really benefit from. The next book is HBR's 10 Must Reads, The Essentials. This was part of a box set of 6 different books, and The Essentials captures things that are in each of the other books: change management, managing yourself, managing others, leadership, etc. This tome has elements of each of those in there. And with any HBR case study, it's written from the perspective of large organizations, but so often, even if you've never, like myself, I've never worked in a large organization, you can still take so many lessons from these case studies about how you can either improve the small business that you manage or managing yourself. The next book is The More of Less by Joshua Becker, another minimalist read. I tend to read at least one minimalist book per year, just as a reminder for me to constantly be cleaning stuff out, not to hoard things. Am I really using what I have? Can I move it on to someone else who would use it more than I would? We own way too much stuff in the developed world, and we would be better served if we got rid of more and more stuff. I often try to sell, as the books back here are you could say my all-time reads, and I still subject them to cleaning. Sometimes a book leaves my all-time reads if it isn't all-time for me anymore. But most of the books, I would say 90 to 95% of the books that I read, I sell or give away. And I try to do that with clothing, etc. And reading a minimalist book like The More of Less by Joshua Becker is a reminder for me to do that. So sometimes you read books to remind you of what you should do. The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. This was a book I was gifted more than 2 decades ago. Started reading, think we got through most of it, but I went to the Khalil Gibran Museum in Lebanon last summer, was reminded that I did have this book, came back and read it, and I found it to be useful and worth reading. Not necessarily the most important thing I've ever read, but one of the best reads of 2024, which is why I'm recommending it for your 2025. An outstanding book about money is The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. That was another personal development book I read last year, and just a really wonderful book about money. Instead of, get rich quick schemes or here's how you're going to become a millionaire, he just pinpoints ways that we think about money and wealth and pokes holes in their flaws and encourages us to think more coherently and more helpfully and more directed at what our goals are. There's a lot to love about that. And then a book that made it onto my all-time list back there is Useful Not True by Derek Sivers, although to be fair, a lot of Derek Sivers books are back there. But more thought experiments. What is it that's really true in our life versus what's useful? He keeps poking at this over and over in this short book. As usual, I don't know how much longer this is going to continue on in my tendency of reading, but for years I've had a category just for scams, and I've been fascinated. I would say this year I had fewer of those scam books, perhaps because reading about Palestine, which is this very large scam that the Zionists have perpetrated on everybody, that I've been somewhat taken by looking at that, but I still managed to read a few books on scams. The first one would be The Cult of We. This is yet another book I've read about WeWork. I've done a lot of study of the subject. A person who I would recommend, I linked to her in the article. Her name's Ash. She has a YouTube channel called Coffee and Cults. She has comprehensively covered WeWork, and I would recommend that to you. But if you'd like to read a book about it, The Cult of We gives a very good general overview of what happens and would be a good companion to Ash's video series. If you want to learn more about Boeing and how it went from being a proud American company to sort of disaster that it is now, you have Flying Blind by Peter Robeson. Walks you through how Boeing developed, how it was effectively taken over by the people at McDonnell Douglas, and then financialized and turned into something less than what it should be, which is an engineering-led company that builds safe planes and is a win-win-win for everybody. It's really a shame. Along the same lines of scams, we have The Fund by Rob Copeland about Ray Dalio and Bridgewater Associates. Fascinating book. I had known that there were questions about Ray Dalio before, but this is basically a comprehensive takedown from somebody who's been following Bridgewater and Dalio for some time, and very satisfying to read, and I would recommend it to you. Now we're on to science fiction. I finally finished the Dune series last year, so 2 books that are there are Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune. This is the end of the Dune series, and I would say the books get less generally recommendable over time. Dune, I think you could probably generally recommend, but over time the material gets more specialized and in some places objectionable. So I would argue don't feel that you have to finish something. I think that this is a trap. That if you say, well, I'm 2 books into a trilogy, I have to finish, always give yourself permission to put a book down. Always give yourself permission to walk away. In my particular case, I wanted to keep reading. I enjoyed it. See, the Dune books are back there. Dune, in its own way, is a thought experiment for, I think, life without God. I think that it's exploring a political universe in which religion is used cynically, and it's I think a great look into modern life. I think that's what's valuable about the Dune universe is what it tells us about how we're living in the modern world, which is often without reference to God, and that's why I think it's useful. Not because I'm endorsing that. I also read the last book in the trilogy for the Silo series by Hugh Wowey, first book of which I covered in a review here, I think about this time last year. And satisfying ending to a trilogy itself. So the ending was satisfying. The book, I think, came up short in a few ways, but I think overall was a good series. I think Wowey creates a compelling and interesting universe for us. Short story, The Hanging Stranger by Philip K. Dick. There are so many of his short stories and novellas which have been really influential. Man in the High Castle, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. The Hanging Stranger, very short story, packs a punch. This is what Dick is so famous for, and why he's worth reading. And then finally, among the science fiction reads, Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. I also ended up doing a film review of the 2 film adaptations that are out there. Solaris asks the question about why are we exploring? What is it that we hope to discover when we explore? And then I would say there's questions about inner exploration and who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. It's not a long novel, and I think it has made it. Yeah, it's back there. It's also another book that made it into my all-time list. So that's it for science fiction. That brings us to a specialized, you could say, category for me. I'm practicing Roman Catholic. It's something that's very important to me, and so I tend to read books about that. In fact, I actually lead a book club discussion once a month. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And this is, you could say a lot of these books came out of these reads, but they're also books that I was reading on my own. The first is on the Catholic martyrs of the Spanish Civil War. If you think you know what happened in the Spanish Civil War because you've been told by mainstream history, I would always point out the same thing that I point out about in the French Revolution. Who was the side that murdered and raped nuns? And once you can digest that fact, then ask yourself, were they probably the good guys? The guys that are murdering and raping nuns? Because they're the ones who are told we're the good guys. And if you can pause and stop and hold that fact and then say, what else was I not told about? So this book is not a historical account of the war. There's plenty of books, I think, out there covering that. This is an account of the martyrs, the people who were specifically murdered and killed by the communists in Spain. Worth reading. The Dialogues of St. Catherine of Siena, I think somewhat of a technical read, but still very beautifully written while St. Catherine was in ecstasy. And once again, reminding us of our duty to love God and our neighbor, which you could say is the central demand of the Christian life. But here, let's say, put forward to us in a short form. It's not very long, as I say, but technical in some places. Essays of a Catholic by Hilaire Belloc. Belloc, writing not so long ago, reminding us of the fact that England was wrenched away violently from Catholicism centuries ago, and that institutional hatred of Catholicism and Catholics was programmed into England and still exists to this day, somewhat tied to another book that I'm going to recommend, which is St. Joan of Arc. St. Joan of Arc had to be so hated in English culture and society that you can see suspicion of her as a witch in Shakespeare's Henry VI series. I remember reading this and thinking, wow, this is how deep the propaganda goes. But obviously, St. Joan of Arc, wonderful saint, and interestingly embraced by all sides in France. The leftists like her, obviously the traditionalists love her, the Catholics like her, atheists like her as well, but she's seen for whatever people want to imagine her for. when the reality is what she stood for was very clearly a Catholic France free of the English, and not as a, you could say, feminist icon or a a fighter for human rights or religious freedom. This is not at all what Saint Joan of Arc fought for, but she's held up that way by others. But that's a relation of her to England. She's also on the list. A fellow countryman of Hilaire Belloc would be Cardinal Manning. He gave a series of lectures on the different sovereignties of God over our life, over our intellect, over our will, over our society, the course of world history. These lectures were then compiled into a book. It's not a very long one. And I think he thoughtfully explains how our Creator rightfully has sovereignty over these different aspects of our lives in different ways that we can recognize and adhere or conform ourselves to these realities, or at the very minimum, recognize them. The Mass by Father Joseph Dunney, the traditional Latin Mass in the Roman Rite, dates back to the time of St. Gregory the Great. And this book, written as a textbook, but doesn't read like a textbook. So at the end of each chapter, there are questions, but it's written in a really interesting, compelling way, talking about both historical and devotional aspects of each part of the Mass. So really helpful book. I'd had it for some time. Finally, I had a chance to read it. Really enjoyed it. Same thing for The Mystical Body of Christ in the Modern World by Father Dennis Fahey. I would classify this as one of these before and after books that once you read it, you think about how you used to conceive of things before reading it and how you think about things completely differently after reading it. And there's many different books in different genres that I felt that way. Once I read Fast Food Nation, 1984, Omnivore's Dilemma. There's all sorts of books that once you read them, you see the world differently. And this particular book really underlining the importance of supernaturalism in relation to naturalism, that so many of us can get caught up with only a natural way of understanding the world in our lives, when of course overlaying all of that is a supernatural world and a supernatural life, and that has to be given primacy. And so often we get pulled towards naturalism without recognizing supernaturalism. And the people who are fighting for naturalism are our enemies, and they have to be opposed. And this book is very important for helping us understand who those enemies are. The last text is potentially a more specialist issue, a small pamphlet based on a talk given by a priest in Italy about a specific part of the canon of the Mass of Prayer and why you would not mention someone who is a heretic, who is claiming to be Pope, when he's not actually the Pope. As I say, perhaps a more specialized thing, you can read my book review and read the text if you'd like to learn a little bit more. But there it is, 45 books from my 2024, which might be part of your 2025. Please let me know in the comments if you have questions about any of these, or if you have suggestions for me. Oh, Stephen, you like this? Maybe you would like this. I'm always happy to take book suggestions. That's one of my favorite things about having a book review channel, is I get to learn from you all, hopefully as much as I'm sharing some of my learnings with you. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so by buying from any of the links in the article that I linked to. There's a link to buy all of the books. There's links to the YouTube reviews of them. If you'd like to thank me for this particular review, you can you can buy any of the books from those various links, but you can also send me a buy me a coffee or a PayPal donation. If you want to support the work on an ongoing basis, I have Patreon, YouTube membership, and if you'd like to contribute books for me to read and review in the future, my Amazon wish list is linked below. So if it's on my Amazon wish list, it's a book I'm already interested in. So if you could say you could sponsor the review by buying the book for me, sending it my way, and if you want, I could potentially give you a shout out in the review if you'd like. So hopefully some of these books make it onto your list for 2025. I'd love it if they did, and I'd love to hear from you when you have read them and shared your thoughts with me. Until next time, enjoy your reading.